The Coalfield Terror War, mass arrests and prison brutality in 1870s America. Before we begin, if you care about real American history that most people never talk about, this channel is for you. We uncover the prison stories, the hidden trials, and the dark moments that shaped the United States. Every week, we bring you powerful true crime stories from real events. Subscribe now and step inside history's most shocking cases. The gunfire echoed across the dark hills before the sun even rose. Men ran between wooden shacks, boots slamming against frozen dirt. Smoke drifted through the cold morning air. A miner fell to his knees, hands in the air, shouting that he had done nothing wrong. Armed deputies surrounded him anyway. Behind them stood coal company guards with rifles pointed at every doorway. Women screamed from the porches. Children hid behind water barrels. The deputies kicked in doors one by one, dragging men out in chains. "Radical," one officer shouted. "Troublemaker," another said. By sunrise, more than 30 miners were tied together with rope and marched down the muddy road toward waiting wagons. Some had never carried a weapon. Some had never even joined a union meeting. But that did not matter. They were going to prison. And as the wagons rolled away, one question hung heavy in the smoky air. Who was really guilty in the Coalfield Terror War? To understand how this happened, we must go back to the 1870s, back to the coal fields of Pennsylvania. The land was black with coal dust. The air tasted like smoke. Coal powered America. It heated homes, fueled factories, and moved trains across the country. Coal was money. Coal was power. But for the miners, coal was suffering. Most miners were poor immigrants, many from Ireland. They worked deep underground for long hours. The tunnels were tight and dark. Explosions happened without warning. Roofs collapsed. Some men never came back to the surface. They were paid little. Sometimes they were not paid in real money at all. Instead, they received company tokens that could only be used at company stores. The prices in those stores were high. Families stayed poor no matter how hard the men worked. If a miner spoke up, he was fired. If he tried to organize with others, he was watched. If he complained too loudly, he could disappear from the job list forever. Tension began to grow like a storm cloud over the hills. Miners wanted safer working conditions. They wanted fair pay. They wanted respect. So they began meeting quietly after work. They talked in small groups, often in secret. The mine owners saw danger in those meetings. Around this time, whispers began spreading about a group called the Maguires. Some said they were protectors of miners. Others said they were violent radicals who used threats and murder to scare mine bosses. Stories spread of nighttime attacks. A mine supervisor shot outside his home. A company official beaten in the dark. Anonymous letters left on doorsteps. Fear moved through the coal fields like wildfire. Mine owners demanded action. They told state officials that the coal region was under attack by a secret terror group. They said law and order were collapsing. They called it a war, the Coalfield Terror War. But here's the part that makes this story painful. Not everyone accused was guilty. To fight what they called terror, the coal companies hired private detectives. One of them was a man named James McParland. He worked undercover, pretending to be a miner. He joined meetings. He listened. He made friends. For years, he gathered information, or at least he claimed he did. By the mid-1870s, arrests began. Men were pulled from their homes at night. Some were arrested based only on witness claims. Some were named by informants who hoped to reduce their own sentences. Some were accused simply because they attended a meeting. The newspapers printed bold headlines about secret terror plots. Readers in big cities imagined wild gangs hiding in the mountains. But life in the coal towns was not simple good versus evil. It was hunger versus power. The trials began in 1876 and 1877. Courtrooms were packed. Armed guards stood outside. Mine owners sat close to prosecutors. The accused miners sat in chains. Many jurors had ties to the coal companies. Testimony often depended on one key witness, McParlin. He told dramatic stories about secret oaths and murder plans. He described hidden signals and coded messages. The juries listened. Some miners were found guilty of murder. Others were convicted of conspiracy. Several were sentenced to death, and many more were sent to prison. Families were left behind with nothing. Children watched their fathers disappear behind iron bars. The prisons of the 1870s were not places of comfort. They were cold, harsh, and strict. Inmates worked long hours. Silence was enforced. Punishments were severe. For some miners, prison was worse than the mines. Outside the prison walls, fear did not fade. Mine owners claimed victory. They said the terror threat had been crushed, but many miners believed something different. They believed the Coalfield Terror War had become a war against workers. They whispered that men were being punished not for violence, but for standing together. The public was divided. Some Americans believed the miners were dangerous radicals who deserved prison. Others believed the trials were unfair and driven by powerful companies protecting profits. In June 1877, 10 alleged Molly Maguires were hanged in Pennsylvania. The executions were carried out under heavy guard. Crowds gathered outside. Some people cheered, others cried. The message was clear. Challenge the coal kings, and you could lose everything. Yet something did not feel finished, because even after the executions, arrests continued. More miners were taken, more prison cells filled, and in the quiet corners of coal towns, anger grew. One night, after a long day of work, a young miner named Patrick sat at his kitchen table. He had never harmed anyone. He had never carried a weapon, but he had attended meetings asking for better pay. There was a knock at his door, hard, loud, angry. Deputies stood outside with a warrant. His wife grabbed his arm. "What did you do?" she whispered. Patrick shook his head. "I only spoke," he said. They dragged him into the dark, and as he was pushed into the back of a wagon, he realized something terrifying. Speaking could now mean prison. The Coalfield Terror War was no longer about secret violence. It was about power controlling a region. By the late 1870s, the coal fields were quieter, but it was the quiet of exhaustion, not peace. Hundreds of miners were arrested. Many were imprisoned. Some were executed. Whether they were all guilty remains debated even today. Historians still argue about the fairness of the trials. Some believe real crimes were committed. Others believed the evidence was weak and the panic was strong. But one fact cannot be denied. Prisons were used as weapons in this war. The Coalfield Terror War changed how America saw labor movements. It showed how quickly workers could be labeled terrorists. It showed how fear could fill prison cells. And it left scars on families that lasted generations. But here's the question that still burns. Did the arrests stop violence, or did they create something deeper? Because in the shadows of the coal hills, anger was not dead. It was waiting. And in the next chapter, that anger will explode in ways no one expected. If you think this story is just about the past, think again. What happens when power decides who is dangerous? Stay with me.
The prison yard was silent the morning the rope snapped tight.
A crowd stood outside the stone walls of Carbon County Jail on June 21, 1877. Inside, 10 men waited. Some prayed, some stared at the floor. One of them whispered that history would remember this day differently than the newspapers did. When the trapdoors opened, the Coalfield Terror War reached its darkest moment. Church bells rang across nearby towns. Some people called it justice, others called it murder carried out by the state. But as the bodies were taken down, something unexpected began to spread through the coal region. Not fear, anger. The executions were meant to end the violence. The mine owners believed that once the alleged Maguires were gone, the Coalfields would return to order. The newspapers declared that the terror group had been crushed. Yet in mining towns across Pennsylvania, wives held their children and cried. Men stood outside company stores and spoke in low voices. They did not shout, they did not riot, but they did not forget. The war had shifted. It was no longer just about secret violence in the hills. It was now about power, prisons, and whether justice had truly been served. After the hangings, more arrests followed. The Pinkerton detectives continued their work. Informants stepped forward, some hoping for lighter sentences, others fearing they would be next if they stayed silent. Men were charged with conspiracy. That word became powerful. It did not require proof of pulling a trigger. It did not require proof of striking a blow. It only required connection. If you attended a meeting, if you knew someone accused, if your name was spoken in court, you could be sent to prison. The courtrooms felt heavy and tense. Armed guards stood at every door. Mine owners often sat close to prosecutors. The defense lawyers had fewer resources. Some miners could barely speak English. Many did not understand the legal words being used against them. Outside, life continued in a strange, quiet way. Coal still had to be mined. Families still needed food. Children still went to school. But something had changed in the air. Trust had broken. Some miners stopped attending meetings altogether. They feared being watched. They feared informants. They feared the knock on the door at night. And yet, beneath the fear, there was also stubborn hope. Labor groups in other states began paying attention. Newspapers outside Pennsylvania questioned the fairness of the trials. Some editors asked whether private detectives should hold so much influence in criminal cases. James McParland, the undercover Pinkerton agent, became a central figure in the story. He was praised by some as a hero who saved the coal industry from terror. Others believed he exaggerated threats and pushed authorities toward mass arrests. His testimony had helped send men to prison. His words had shaped the trials. But years later, people would ask, was every accusation true? The prisons filled. Inside, life was harsh. Inmates followed strict silence rules. They worked long hours. They marched in lines. Punishment for breaking rules could mean isolation or physical discipline. Some of the imprisoned miners insisted they were innocent. They wrote letters home saying they had never planned violence. They said they had only wanted fair wages and safer mines. Their families struggled without them. A wife might take in washing. A teenage son might enter the mines too early, breathing in coal dust before his body was ready. Some families moved away. Others stayed, hoping their loved ones would someday walk free. The coal companies regained control of the region. Production continued. Profits stabilized. From the outside, it looked like order had returned. But in 1877, something else was happening across America. That summer, the Great Railroad Strike erupted. Workers in multiple states protested wage cuts. Rail lines were blocked. Clashes with militia and police broke out. Violence spread through cities like Baltimore and Pittsburgh. The fear of labor uprisings grew nationwide. Suddenly, the events in the coalfields looked less like a local problem and more like part of a larger struggle between workers and powerful companies. Officials worried that labor unrest could turn into widespread rebellion.
They believed strong action was necessary to prevent chaos, and prisons became one of their strongest tools. In Pennsylvania's coal region, authorities remained watchful. Any sign of organized resistance was quickly shut down. Meetings were monitored, suspected leaders were questioned. Even peaceful gatherings could be labeled dangerous. For some miners, the lesson was clear: stay silent or risk prison. But silence has a cost. As the months passed, stories began to circulate about the conditions inside prison. Former inmates described cold cells and endless labor. They spoke of the mental strain of isolation. They told of men who lost hope. These stories spread quietly from town to town. People began to ask whether the punishment had gone too far. Yet others remained convinced that strong measures had saved lives. They pointed to the killings of mine officials in earlier years. They argued that without arrests and executions, violence would have continued. The truth sat somewhere in between, heavy and complicated. Real violence had occurred in the coalfields. Mine bosses had been attacked, supervisors had been shot. Fear was real, but so had poverty. So had dangerous working conditions. So had injustice. The Coalfield Terror War was not a simple story of good and evil. It was a collision of desperation and authority. One evening in late 1878, a small group of miners gathered quietly in a barn. They did not swear secret oaths. They did not plan attacks. They talked about safer tunnels and fair pay. But someone was watching. A deputy sheriff reported the meeting. The next week, 2 of those miners were questioned. They were not charged, but the warning was clear. The war may have slowed, but it was not forgotten. Years later, historians would look back and debate the trials. Some would argue that the legal system had been influenced too heavily by coal interests. Others would defend the convictions as necessary to restore peace. But for the families who lived through it, the debate was personal. A child who grew up without a father did not think in legal terms. A widow who struggled to feed her children did not care about political arguments. They remembered the knock at the door. They remembered the chains. They remembered the prison walls. By the end of 1879, the coal region was quieter than it had been in years. The large-scale arrests had slowed. The hangings were over. Yet something else had changed in America. The government had shown it would use prison power to crush what it believed was domestic terror. Companies had shown they could influence law enforcement when profits were threatened. Workers had learned that organizing carried serious risks, and the idea of labeling labor activism as terror had taken root. But here is the part that makes this story even more powerful. The Coalfield Terror War did not disappear. It became a warning passed down through generations of workers. It shaped future labor movements. It influenced how unions organized. It taught leaders to be cautious, to document carefully, to avoid giving authorities reasons to accuse them. The scars remained long after the trials ended. As the 1870s closed, one former miner stood outside the prison gates, finally released after serving years for conspiracy. His hair was grayer, his hands were rough. He looked at the hills he once worked in. He did not shout, he did not raise a fist. He simply said, "They feared our voices." And that quiet statement carried more weight than any headline. Because the Coalfield Terror War was not just about violence, it was about fear of change. And as America moved into a new decade, new industries, and new labor battles, the question remained: would prisons continue to be used as weapons against workers, or would the country find another way? In the next chapter, we will see how the legacy of the Coalfield Terror War reshaped labor justice in America, and how the debate over guilt and innocence still echoes today. Stay with me. The prison door slammed shut, and the sound echoed down the long stone hallway like thunder. Inside his narrow cell, the former miner stood still, listening to the fading footsteps of the guard. He had been released once before, questioned again, and now brought back under suspicion tied to another investigation. His crime this time was not violence, it was association. Outside, winter winds swept across the Pennsylvania coal hills. Smoke rose from company-owned houses. The mines were running again, louder than ever. But inside those prison walls, the Coalfield Terror War was not over.
The men held there were not all killers. Some had been convicted of murder, others of conspiracy. Some had never fully understood the charges read against them in court. Yet all wore the same uniform. All followed the same strict rules. Silence during meals, silence during work, silence in the yard. The prison believed silence could break a man faster than chains. Days were long and cold. Inmates woke before sunrise. They worked at stone cutting, carpentry, or other labor ordered by prison officials. Guards watched closely. Any sign of disobedience meant punishment. Isolation cells waited in the darkest part of the building. Some prisoners insisted they were innocent. They spoke quietly at night when guards were far away. They repeated the same words over and over. I never harmed anyone. But the state had already decided. Outside the prison, coal production increased. Mine owners pointed to the calm as proof that the crackdown had worked. They told newspapers that order had been restored because strong action had been taken. Yet not everyone believed that story. Across America, labor groups were growing stronger. Workers in steel, railroads, and factories were organizing. They had watched what happened in the coal fields. They had seen how quickly men could be labeled terrorists. The Coalfield Terror War became a warning. In Pennsylvania towns, the memory stayed alive. Children who had seen their fathers arrested were now teenagers. They heard whispers about unfair trials. They listened to debates in church halls and small meeting rooms. Some believed the Maguires had truly committed violent acts. They pointed to the shootings and beatings of mine officials. They said law and order had to be protected. Others believed the response had gone too far. They argued that the courts had been influenced by powerful coal companies. They questioned whether juries had been truly neutral. The truth remained complicated. Real violence had happened. Mine supervisors had been attacked. Fear had spread through the hills. But fear had also spread through the homes of miners. One evening, a former prison guard sat in a tavern speaking quietly to a friend. He described how some inmates broke down under isolation. He said one man stared at the wall for hours without speaking. Another scratched dates into stone, counting the days until release. These were not monsters, the guard admitted softly. They were men. Stories like that moved slowly through communities. Meanwhile, James McParland, the undercover detective whose testimony helped convict many miners, continued his career. He was praised by some as a hero who had stopped organized terror, but others questioned his role. They wondered how much of what he reported had been shaped by the expectations of the coal companies that hired him. Years later, historians would examine court records carefully. They would ask whether every confession had been reliable. They would debate whether fear of labor unrest influenced the legal process. Back inside the prison, tension grew during one cold spring morning. An inmate refused to move during work detail. He stood still, staring at the guard. I have done my time, but I will not carry guilt that is not mine. The guard raised his voice. Other inmates watched without speaking. The man was dragged to isolation. For hours afterward, silence in the yard felt heavier than before, because that moment reminded everyone that the Coalfield Terror War was not only about past violence, it was about identity. Were these men criminals, or were they symbols of something larger? As the 1880s approached, labor activism did not disappear. In fact, it grew stronger nationwide. Unions became more organized. Leaders learned from the mistakes of the coal fields. They kept better records. They avoided secret meetings when possible. They tried to protect themselves from being accused of conspiracy. The
The legacy of the Coalfield Terror War shaped those strategies. In Pennsylvania, some families continued to fight for the reputations of executed men. They believed history would one day clear their names. They kept letters and trial papers safe in wooden boxes. Decades later, public opinion would slowly shift. Many Americans began to see the events of the 1870s not only as a fight against violence, but also as a clash between powerful companies and vulnerable workers. Yet at the time, none of that was certain. In the prison chapel one Sunday afternoon, an old inmate spoke quietly to a younger one. "Power fears unity," he said. The younger man looked confused. "What does that mean?" "It means when workers stand together, those above them grow nervous." The guard called for silence, but the message lingered. Outside, coal trains rolled through valleys, carrying fuel that powered American cities. Few people in those cities thought about the arrests in the hills. Few understood the cost paid by mining families. The Coalfield Terror War slowly faded from front-page headlines, but it did not fade from memory. Years later, when new labor disputes erupted, speakers would mention the 1870s coal trials as a lesson. They would warn that fear could turn peaceful organizing into criminal conspiracy in the eyes of the powerful. The prison where many miners had been held eventually changed. Policies softened over time. Public executions ended. Legal standards improved. But the question remained buried deep in the history of American justice. How do you protect order without crushing voices? One evening, as the sun set behind the coal hills, a recently released miner walked past the old jail. He stopped and looked at its stone walls. He did not shout. He did not curse. He simply touched the cold stone and whispered, "We were more than what they called us." That whisper carried through generations. The Coalfield Terror War had shown America how quickly fear could fill prison cells. It had shown how labels like terrorist could change lives forever. And even though the guns were quiet now, the debate over justice, labor rights, and prison power was only beginning. In the next chapter, the story will move beyond the prison walls into the courtroom battles and public debates that would challenge the verdicts of the past. Because history does not stay buried, and neither does truth. Stay with me. The courtroom was full again. Years had passed since the hangings, years since the prison wagons rolled through the coal towns. Many believed the Coalfield Terror War was finished, sealed inside history books. But on this day, the past had returned. A gray-haired man stood before a judge, holding old trial papers in his shaking hands. His father had been executed in 1877. He was a child when deputies took him away. Now he was grown, and he wanted answers. Was it justice, or was it fear? The room fell silent. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered. Historians had begun re-examining the Coalfield trials. New questions were being asked about evidence, jury selection, and the power of the coal companies. The war that once filled prisons was now being fought in memory. In the decades after the 1870s, America changed. Labor unions grew stronger. Workers demanded rights openly. Strikes still happened, but leaders were more careful. They remembered how easily meetings had once been called conspiracy. The Coalfield Terror War became a lesson whispered in union halls. Do not give them reason to call you dangerous. Do not let fear shape the story. Families of the convicted miners never stopped defending their names. They kept letters written from prison cells. They passed down stories about fathers who said they were innocent. They spoke about trials where private detectives had been key witnesses. Some historians argued that real violence had happened and that certain men were guilty of murder. They pointed to sworn testimony and the deaths of mine officials. Others believed the legal process had been deeply unfair. They said powerful companies had too much influence. They argued that juries had been truly neutral. The truth remained complicated, but what was clear was this: the prisons had been full. Men had been locked away not only for actions, but sometimes for connections. The word conspiracy had enormous weight, and in the 20th century, that weight was slowly examined. In the late 1900s, Pennsylvania officials reviewed parts of the old cases. Public discussions grew louder, documentaries were made, articles were written. The descendants of miners asked the state to recognize possible injustice.
Then, something remarkable happened. More than a century after the executions, the governor of Pennsylvania granted a symbolic pardon to the executed Molly Maguires. It did not erase history. It did not bring anyone back. But it sent a message. The state acknowledged that doubt existed, that fear may have shaped decisions, that justice might not have been perfect. For families, it was emotional. Some cried, some felt relief, some said it was too late. But the Coalfield Terror War was no longer just a story about violence in the 1870s. It had become a story about how power, fear, and prison can collide. Back in the coal towns, the mines eventually slowed. Machines replaced many workers. New industries came. The wooden houses aged. The prison walls stood as stone reminders of another era. Yet when older residents told stories to younger generations, they still spoke about the knock on the door. They spoke about men taken in chains. They spoke about how quickly neighbors were labeled threats. The war had not only been fought with guns, it had been fought with courtrooms and prison cells. And its legacy stretched far beyond Pennsylvania. Across America, lawmakers and judges continued debating how to balance security and freedom, how to stop violence without punishing innocent association, how to prevent terror without silencing workers. Those debates still exist today because the Coalfield Terror War asked a question that never truly goes away. When fear rises, who decides who is dangerous? In one final quiet scene, an elderly woman visited a small cemetery where one of the executed miners was buried. She placed flowers on the grave. "He was more than a headline," she whispered. The wind moved gently across the grass. The coal dust that once covered the hills had settled long ago, but memory had not. The Coalfield Terror War began with gunshots in the dark and ended with prison doors slamming shut. It passed through trials shaped by power, through families broken by absence, through a nation learning how easily justice can be influenced by fear. Some believe the crackdown saved lives. Others believe it crushed voices that only wanted fairness. What remains undeniable is this: prisons were used as weapons during that war, and the lessons from those stone cells still echo today. If this story moved you, remember that history is not just about the past. It shapes how we see power, protest, and prison even now. The Coalfield Terror War may have ended in the 1870s, but its questions are still alive. If this story opened your eyes, there are many more waiting for you here. History is full of secrets, prison walls, and truths that still matter today. Join this growing community of true crime lovers who want the full story, not just the headlines. Subscribe now, and I'll see you in the next case.